If I were to make sensational newspaper headlines about some of this week's activity, I wonder how they'd read. The betrayal of an ally, or an emperor's humiliation. Yeah, those are pretty good. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, Operation Michael, the first phase of the German spring offensives, came to an end. The Germans took huge amounts of territory and prisoners, but dangerously extended their lines and failed to take Amiens. Britain's offensive in Palestine to take Amman also failed, and they retreated back across the River Jordan. Germany began phase 2 of its attacks in the west this week. Haste continued to be the top of German Quartermaster General Erich Ludendorff's plans. He could not give his enemy a chance to take the offensive. At the beginning of the week, Operation Archangel, began. It had originally been a diversion to support Operation Michael, but now it was to reduce the salient their advance had created. The primary objective was the high ground east of the Oise-Ain Canal. The attack ended the 9th after good progress had shortened their lines 7 kilometers. As we saw last week, Ludendorff no longer had the manpower for St. George I, his operation in Flanders. But St. George II would go ahead on a reduced scale. This would be Operation Georgette. On April 9th, Ludendorff's 53rd birthday, on which the Kaiser gave him a little statue of the Kaiser. Yep. It began with the Battle of La Lys against the British and Portuguese. The overall objective was to cross the Lys River, overrun the southern Ypres salient, and drive to the coast between Calais and Dunkirk. The main objective was Hazebrouck Railway Junction. The attack was on a 16-kilometer front, and British intelligence had wrongly guessed it was coming at Vimy Ridge, so it was, like the beginning of Michael, an immediate success, causing the Allies to retreat. 6,000 Portuguese troops were taken prisoner, and a 6-kilometer gap was opened in the British lines. Now, these Portuguese had been in the lines way too long and were to have been rotated out that very morning. So this was really quite unfortunate timing for them. This was, though, where Portuguese soldier Anibal Milhais, known as Soldier Million, covering the retreat, began building his legend, holding off the Germans so intensely with his Lewis gun that they went around him and he was behind enemy lines for 3 days. Also, 2,000 tons of mustard gas was shot on the British, incapacitating 8,000 men, many blinded. By the second day, the British sent in Herbert Plumer's Second Army. He just returned from Italy. The Germans still had some day one problems, though. Their left wing had been held fast at Givenchy. Also, they had serious difficulty bringing forward artillery. The soft, wet ground made the tanks, along with all other heavy equipment, road-bound. When the tanks started breaking down along the few and relatively narrow avenues of approach, they blocked the advance of the accompanying artillery. The stalled tanks had to be blown in place before the supporting guns could be moved up. This experience could not have done much to ameliorate Ludendorff's blind spot for the tanks. On the 10th, the British were driven from Messines, which they took last summer, and on the 11th, British Commander Sir Douglas Haig gave his famous Special Order of the Day. There is no course open to us but to fight it out. Every position must be held to the last man. There must be no retirement. With our backs to the wall and believing in the justice of our cause, each one of us must fight to the end. Noble words, but there were doors in that wall, and A World Undone says Haig was discussing with U.S. President Woodrow Wilson a possible removal of British armies from France via the Channel ports. On the 11th, the Germans took Armentières, though on the left, they were still held up at Givenchy and Festubert. By the end of the week, they were within 8 kilometers of Hazebrouck, behind which lay those Channel ports. But I have to say that the British retreat was not a rout. It was, in fact, a controlled retreat. That same day, Ludendorff met with his staff to consider a new attack on Amiens for the 20th. The Allies had actually had an important staff meeting of their own. Last week on the 3rd, they met and agreed to strengthen Ferdinand Foch's authority as overall commander. Haig, who had supported Foch's rise to the position 2 weeks ago, was now no longer interested. Since the French had taken over parts of his line, and since British troops were arriving from Egypt and Mesopotamia, he saw no need any longer to be directed by anyone else. But on the 14th, so next week, Foch is given the title General-in-Chief of the Allied armies. In no uncertain terms, he is Haig's boss. April 6th marks 1 year since the United States joined the war. President Wilson made a speech in Baltimore saying that the reasons for the war are more clearly disclosed than ever before. We know what the war must cost, if need be, all we possess. Wilson goes on to point out Germany's terms to Russia with the Brest-Litovsk Treaty from a month ago. Russia, if you remember, had to give up 700,000 square kilometers of territory and 50 million people, in addition to vast sources of raw materials. Wilson says this is Germany acknowledging that it's not justice, but dominion they seek. And by Germany, he means her military leaders, who are her real rulers. Her statesmen give lip service to peace. The real test of their justice and fair play appears in their action in Russia. The German idea is a world empire of gain and commercial supremacy. He then says that he does not wish to judge harshly and is still ready to discuss an honest peace. But German proceedings in Russia have given him his answer, and he accepts the challenge. Only one answer is possible, and that is force. Force without limit. One of the Central Powers leaders had, though, at least thought about possible peace. Last year, in March 1917, I talked about what would become known as the Sixtus Affair. This was when Austro-Hungarian Emperor Karl had written detailing his willingness to make a separate peace with the Allies, abandoning Germany. He wrote a letter that went to the British and French prime ministers on the subject, and he and his foreign minister Count Czernin had even met with two princes representing the Allies as intermediaries to negotiate. Karl's letter stated that he supported French claims to Alsace-Lorraine and agreed in principle to the restoration of Belgian independence. Now, this never came to anything because France got a new prime minister who wasn't interested, and anyhow, Italy wasn't even mentioned, and that was kind of a big deal for Austria's war. And this was all secret too, right? Okay. But now, Count Czernin gives a speech attacking current French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau as being the main obstacle to peace. Now, this made Clemenceau pretty angry, and so he published Karl's letter from last year. This blew up big time, so as you can imagine how thrilled Germany was to find out that Karl had been plotting to abandon them. In fact, there was now even worry that Germany might occupy Austria-Hungary. Czernin got Karl to send his word of honor to the other three Central Powers that the letter was never supposed to be seen by the French government, that Belgium was not even mentioned, and Clemenceau was lying about Alsace-Lorraine. Czernin even tried to persuade Karl to step down as emperor, but in the end, it is Czernin himself who resigns 2 days from now on the 14th. Now, this was an enormous embarrassment for Karl, and the end result was Austria-Hungary becoming even more dependent on Germany. Czernin is succeeded by Count Burian von Rajec, but Karl's empire was really fragmenting by now. Anyhow, the Allies certainly encouraged that. On the 8th, the Conference of Nationalities Oppressed by Austria opens. This was set up by the Allies in Rome. Even the Italian government, with all its earlier hopes of winning Austrian land on the Dalmatian coast, now accepted the Southern Slavs' right to future independence. Another empire, though, was trying to take away someone's independence. Marching toward the Caucasus on the 6th, the Ottomans occupied Ardahan. The Armenians withdrew towards Novoselem, hoping to check the Turkish advance on Kars. But by the 9th, the Turks are marching on Batum and Kars. Among the men at the front, there is no doubt they were facing a renewal of the war with the Turks. But the newly established rulers of Transcaucasia still continued to believe in a peaceful solution, and their intervention deprived the troops on the frontier of their last chance of serious resistance. And as the week ends, Russia protests to Germany about Germany's landing of troops in Finland last week, and also to consuls in Moscow about last week's British and Japanese landing in Vladivostok. Wilson makes a speech against the Germans. The Germans launch a new and so far successful offensive in Flanders, and Emperor Karl's old plans now blow up in his face. Well, I'm about 100% certain he did not expect that to happen. I do wonder, though, why neither Clemenceau nor any other Allied leaders published the letter earlier. It certainly sowed discord among the Central Powers. You know what, though? There was a very long-term result of Karls' hope for peace and the role he played in trying, even in secret, to bring it about in 1917 and 1918? In 2004, he was beatified by Pope John Paul II. The Pope said this of Blessed Karl of Austria: "To his eyes, war appeared as something appalling. His chief concern was to follow the Christian vocation, also in his political actions. For this reason, his thoughts turned to social assistance. May he be an example for us all, especially those who have political responsibilities in Europe today." If you've forgotten how the Portuguese ended up in this war in the first place, you might want to check out our Portugal special right here. It's great, and there is a bit more about the Battle of Lalice in there. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Gustavo Loyola. Obrigado, Gustavo. And to all the fans around the world who support this show, do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.